Is this guy serious? A console-killing gaming PC for $250? But wait, there's more. Welcome back to comptv, a place you can go for all things tech. My name is Lee, and I'm here to show you how you can demolish the 1080p FPS of modern games without killing your wallet. This build is guaranteed to max out the settings of all the most popular PC games such as League of Legends, CSGO, and Overwatch, as well as tackle the newer AAA titles from well-balanced high settings. This includes games shared by our console neighbors, but with better performance and usually much better graphics too. In fact, I'll test everything in Ultra just to show you how far this thing can go. First, I'll show you the parts and their associated prices, as well as some fancy shots of the final build, and then I'll show you some live in-game performance, and wrap up with some closing thoughts. This is as much a tutorial as it is a build video, so take notes because there will be a quiz at the end of the video. Okay, not really, but please leave your questions and thoughts in the comment section of this one, because hopefully after this you will not only be able to build a similar system, but one that's even better and possibly even cheaper. To begin, you're going to want to start off with an OEM system. I knew I was going to want a custom case and power supply here, so I bought a system that only included the CPU, heatsink, and 4GB of RAM for about $70. One caveat, however, was that the motherboard I purchased was incompatible with a standard ATX power supply, so I was forced to swap it out for another OEM motherboard for $17, and I loaded up the original CPU and RAM with it. I will later sell the original motherboard to offset the cost, and thankfully the CPU is one of the most expensive used components anyway. Which, speaking of CPUs, we have here a Core i5-2400 clocked at 3.1 GHz with a 3.4 GHz boost clock. This is plenty powerful for today's modern games and should perform only marginally lower than even the latest i5s. This quad-core hyper-threaded old friend is also plenty comparable to the AMD 8-core CPUs in the Xbox and PS4, since it's clocked high enough out of the box and most games only utilize 2 to 4 cores anyway. Clocks over cores, people. Beside even that fact, some light research would show you that these two consoles reserve only 1 or 2 of their 8 cores for game rendering, leaving the rest to be shared between graphics processing and the operating system. All that said, this CPU added $40 to the total and was well worth the investment. To cool the i5 and to save on some dollar bills, we will just be utilizing the stock Intel cooler. I wiped off the old paste for some Arctic MX4, which is not necessary, but feel free to do this as well for a bit of free cooling enhancement. Now, a major setback to this build was that after removing the OEM bracket that came with this board, I found that the stock cooler could not hold tightly enough to the motherboard because the mounting holes were wider than the clips of the stock cooler. So it was time for some hacking. I simply popped out the plastic clamps around the cooler and replaced them with 6 zip ties. 4 wrapped around the 4 holes where the clips used to be on the cooler, and 2 to tighten down the first 4 even more for sufficient contact between the cooler and CPU. This may seem scary, but I actually felt very comfortable with the solution since I was able to secure the cooler very snug. Rest assured though, if you wish to avoid this, simply investing an additional $10 to $20 in a comparable aftermarket cooler, you can install its custom bracket to avoid this altogether. But I'll address this in more detail in the conclusion. Unfortunately, I think not reapplying my thermal paste after this was a mistake since I ended up with higher thermals even when idling, which maxed out close to 70 degrees Celsius and going as high as almost 90 degrees under load. But a quick clean and reseating dropped our temps by about 30 degrees, which is probably also due to a more snug fit. For RAM, again the OEM system came with 4GB of RAM and a 2x2 dual channel configuration at 1333 MHz, which would be enough for most games, but just to play it safe, I added another 4GB of RAM for a total of 8, adding to only $16.50 to the total of the build. To power the budget beast, we're using a 450 watt 80 plus bronze weighted power supply from EVGA, which I snatched on Black Friday for $17 after mail-in rebate. This should be plenty of juice for our system, especially since we can't do much overclocking, and because our GPU doesn't need a 6-pin power plug either. As for that GPU, possibly the most exciting part of the build, this system will be rocking a Zotac Mini GeForce GTX 1050, utilizing the latest Pascal architecture, 2GB of DDR3 RAM, and an out-of-the-box boost clock of 1.46 GHz. This was the cheapest of the 1050 options, all of which have pretty much the exact same performance, so it was a no-brainer at the $88 price tag on Black Friday. We will also discuss later in this video how you can have equal or better performance for cheaper, but I really wanted to use a GTX 1050. Our only drive for the system is a 640GB Western Digital Caviar Black drive. The Black series are known for their performance, and I grabbed a pair of these for $40 off eBay, which cutting that in half gives us this one drive, adding only a $20 to the budget build's total. And finally, to house everything, I grabbed a Corsair Carbide Spec 01 for $25 after rebate on Black Friday. It came with a single red LED intake fan, which I coupled with one that I had lying around, but do note that this was just for the aesthetics of this video, since the lightly powered system should run completely fine without an outtake. This case is another item that can be easily compromised for a lower budget, but should be super fun to work in given its extended back panel and tray cutouts for managing all our cables. They did in fact come in handy, although after zip tying and bunching cables together wherever I could, I did have to lie the case on its side to close it properly. But thankfully, along with the cable management features and a cardboard cutout from my PSU box to hide the mangled mess, the final product gave us enough room to sit back, relax, and enjoy the lovely red glow out of the side panel. You'll notice I didn't include the price of an operating system, and that is simply because you can use an unactivated Windows 10 copy forever, with the only issue being the watermark that you will see in the bottom of all the benchmarks. We will recap the total cost of the system in the conclusion, but first, let's see how this budget monster performs. As a quick explanation of how the benchmarks work on this channel, I'll be testing all the gameplay live so that you can actually witness the real-life performance of the build. Although I doubt other people lie about their benchmarks, this is my way of proving to you the validity of the build. One note is that recording the screen will affect the results of the benchmarks, but I will run them once again without recording to provide the final numbers. Furthermore, keep your eye on the top left of the screen, where I'll be providing an on-screen display of the system's current performance, as well as FPS, so you can monitor them yourself and judge my final results. Starting with the synthetic benchmarks, Firestrike Extreme gave the PC a 2970, which according to their charts falls between a 2013 gaming laptop and a VR-ready gaming PC. In reference to DirectX 12, 3D Mark TimeSpy gave the system an 1836, which also falls within that very same bracket of their comparison chart. The i5-2400 earned a 326 on Cinebench, but after turning off the CPU taxing screen recording software, the final score jumped up almost 100 points to 421. Unigine Heaven gave our system a 794 with an average FPS of 31.5. This was set to absolute ultra with tessellation and everything, so this isn't a bad score at all. Finally, VRMark gave the system a 3316 score, which although VRMark shows this score falling only 400 points short of the Oculus Rift minimum specs, the system still scored over 60 FPS in testing, showing that slightly lower settings would solidify the VR ready status of our budget build. Now, it's time to shift gears and check out the in-game benchmarks. Alright guys, so as is customary, we'll be starting off with some Rocket League, and as you can see right here, everything is set to Ultra and anti-aliasing is on as well. The only thing I unchecked is weather effects because I feel like it's a little distracting when you're playing the game. But again, check the FPS with me on the top left, and I'll be hitting the benchmark button as soon as it gets a little crazy. And as you can see, we're already using around 4 gigs of RAM, so that's another thing to look at when making decisions on what to buy, how much to buy. Alright, so it's looking like we got a minimum of 97, a max of 128, and an average of around 110 frames per second with OBS on. And when I turned it off and ran the benchmark again, we got a minimum of 107, a max of 142, and an average of 123 frames per second. So that's a 10 to 15 frame difference, but if you're building the system to play Rocket League, you're going to be well over 60 frames a second, actually double. For Shadow of Mordor, again we're maxing out everything to Ultra, and as you can see we do get a little warning letting us know that our graphics card has less memory than is recommended, but as you can see in the final results we do just fine. To be more specific, we got a minimum of 20 FPS, a maximum of 72, and an average of 41 frames per second. Strangely enough, when I turned off screen recording, I got a minimum of 23, a maximum of 71, and an average of 43 frames per second, giving us a negligible difference within a margin of error. My guess is that this just shows us that the bottleneck here is the GPU. Thankfully, just adjusting the settings a little bit, you should be at a solid 60 FPS with no issues. With H1Z1 set to Ultra and VSync turned off, the only issue we faced here was that for some reason the on-screen display was never recorded. But beside that, the gameplay was quite fluid, getting a minimum of 29 frames per second, a maximum of 51, and an average of 36. That doesn't sound too hot, but after turning off the recording software, we got a minimum of 42 frames per second, a maximum of 56, and an average of 48, which was quite fluid in my opinion. Alright, so next up on our list is Overwatch, and as you can see here, we've already set it to Epic settings, which is the Ultra preset on this game. I also turned off the frame rate cap, which was previously set to 60. Now it's at 300 plus. I don't think we're going to get there, but unfortunately, Rivatuner doesn't work on this game. Overwatch doesn't play well with third-party overlays, so thankfully they included their own. So if you see right here on Advanced Performance Stats, we'll be using the in-game monitoring, so take a look at that. Alright, so taking a look at these benchmarks, it's looking like we were getting a minimum of 35 frames per second, a max of 58, and an average of 45 when OBS was recording, and very quickly after I ran it again and got 43 for the minimum, 64 for the max, and 51 for the average, which is, again, right about the 10 to 15 range. Our max has gone over 60 frames a second, so I think that tuning the settings just a little bit gets you well over 60, so if you want to play a game like Overwatch, this system will do more than enough. Alright, so now it is time to take a look at the infamous City Skylines, which is known for taxing the CPU like crazy. I'm hoping I even needed to turn off VSync because we'll get more than 60, but I don't think it's gonna happen, so let's see how we do. City Skylines gave us a 13 FPS minimum, a 52 maximum, and a 22 frames per second average. Turning off the screen recording software only bumped it up just a little bit to 16 frames per second for the minimum, 61 for the maximum, and 29 as an average. Again, this game is very CPU intensive, so if you're looking to play this, you might either want to get a beefier CPU or get ready for a decent overclock. Even turning down the texture settings only bumped up the FPS by about 5 frames per second, so keep that in mind. Alright, now it's time again to play the AAA title, the gorgeous Doom, and we're going to be playing that on Ultra settings, and again we had to turn on the in-game on-screen display because Rivatuner doesn't work on this game. Looks great. Look, keep your eyes on the top right, and let's get into the benchmark. Alright, so again, this time around, even with OBS recording in the background, we got minimum drops in frames. To be specific, we got 22 for the minimum, 56 for the max, and 34 average with OBS on, and with it off, we got a minimum of 25, a maximum of 60, and an average of 36 frames per second. Overall, it was a great experience. I honestly couldn't even tell that it was below 60 frames per second because the gameplay is so smooth and the game is so optimized. And with VSync on, you could honestly even keep it at this frame rate and still have a very playable experience. But again, you could drop those settings to get any FPS goal you want. For some final thoughts, well, this deal is hard to beat. Given the total price to performance of this system, it no doubt trumps that of today's modern gaming consoles, given that you have complete and total control of the graphic settings of each game, let alone the ability to explore other uses such as audio and video editing. Stuff you can't normally do on either a console or even a newer system at this price. Also, although today's modern consoles do have comparable hardware, they aren't utilized as freely as a PC running Windows or another relatable operating system. But for the sake of our console-hugging friends out there, one main counter-argument is that there are console-exclusive games that are never planned to be released on the PC. So that can be one deciding factor, but those of us wanting to build a system are usually more apt to avoid those titles anyway. And with that said, I guess it's time to admit that I lied. I said the total of the system was $250, but in reality, I was able to snatch all of these parts for a total of $241.96, which also includes all shipping. And another confession I should make is that you could probably build this entire system for even cheaper, as I've been hinting at throughout this entire video. Grabbing comparable used parts against these new ones that I featured in this build could save you upwards of $100, even without the Black Friday deals I used this time around. I've even seen a powerful OEM budget build for $130, and if you don't believe me, there's more about that in the description. Also, there's a PC part picker link down there as well, with the parts in the system and their pricing. Now for some disclaimers. Be careful when buying OEM motherboards, and do your research when selecting products, because the main issue you will inevitably face when dealing with OEM is proprietary hardware. Just in case you're not sure what that is, proprietary hardware is simply components like power supplies, motherboards, power pins, and other hardware that are manufactured specifically for a single build or set of builds. HP and Dell did this a lot in their older systems, crippling the opportunity from updating your hardware apart from their own technical support. This would mean adding a standard ATX power supply to an OEM system or moving the branded PC into a new case could be tricky, if not impossible. To avoid this, simply make sure the motherboard of the target system uses a standard ATX power supply configuration, standard fan pinouts, and try to aim for standard front I/O pinouts as well, since in this system I wasn't able to connect the USB 3.0 or front audio due to the proprietary pinouts of those features. The motherboard holes also didn't align perfectly with all the pre-installed standoffs in this case, but the motherboard was already pretty secure without it. Again, the ultimate way to avoid any upgrade or proprietary hardware issues is to buy the best used OEM system you can find for your budget and slapping in your GPU. Just make sure that there are adequate outputs and wattage for the power supply in that system if you plan on using higher powered graphics cards. That's it for this. I hope you enjoyed my first ever budget build on my channel, and for $250 I am ecstatic with the results. I haven't yet come up with a name for the system, so leave any suggestions below and I'll pick the one that sticks out most. If you don't mind, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, or a thumbs down if you're not PC Master Race. Hit that subscribe button for more tech like this. Merry Christmas, and in case you didn't know, I'm Lee from comptv.